Today's lesson is an examination of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Senator McCarthy was the junior senator from Wisconsin, late in the 1940s and early in the 1950s. Joe McCarthy was a demagogue. Joe McCarthy was a man who was eventually censured by the Senate. That is, officially scolded by the Senate. And eventually he died. He died of complications from his alcoholism. He was a man who discovered ambition. But let me start with today's lesson. The lesson of today is some American politicians use the fear of communism as a potent political weapon. Certainly he did. And their practices challenged and for a time diminished our democratic impulses. Now, the objective that I would have for you today is that I would want you to consider this question. Are there parallels between communism in the 1940s and 50s and the fear that Americans have of Islamic terrorism since 2001? What have we done right in this 21st century? And what have we done wrong in response to this modern phenomenon? I want to begin by explaining to you that if I were a politician, and if I were an unprincipled politician, the best way for me to manage and manipulate you as an electorate is to make you afraid of something. There is no question that fear is a better motivator than hope. Hope is that wonderful, delicious appetite for the better world ahead of us. Fear makes men and women cower, makes them make bad choices, makes them stop listening, make them stop being critical of what it is they're being told and who is providing that evidence. And that's what Joe McCarthy did. He used fear. In World War II, it was easy for us as Americans because we knew who to hate, who to fear. We feared the fascists, the National Socialists, we feared the Japanese Empire, and so long as there was a clear enemy to whom we could invest our fears and our anxieties, then we always knew what to do. We headed off in a certain direction because that's what the government said was the best way to win World War II. Now, the Soviet Union, Russia, was our ally during World War II. You know that. But soon after the war, for example, when we came to dividing up Berlin, the Soviets wanted their share of Berlin because Germany is a neighboring country to them. So the Soviets, under Stalin, created this communist menace. And it was easy for Americans to look at the communist menace as the new enemy to hate. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 gave us an idea of how violent overthrow could be the motivation and the means of enacting their wishes. So we were afraid of it since 1917. In the 1930s, there were communists in America. There were communists with a small c. Not that were connected to Moscow and the Soviet Marxist conspiracy. These were people who believed that as poorly as capitalism had served us in the late 20s and early 30s, there might be some consolation to be gained by having things in common. Products, land, homes, the ability to produce goods and services. That was communism with a small c. And there were, in fact, communist politicians. There were communist writers. But those were people who were looking for a better life, not for looking to subjugation, to Soviet communism. Now, perhaps the Marxist model of economics is what they were embracing. But Stalin, while he may have been a Marxist, was into world conquest. And there was no question that the Soviet Union was very much weakened. Russia was weakened after World War II. So if they were to once again be great, it was a wonderful time for them to take advantage of the Eastern European neighbors who themselves have been decimated by the war. So if the Soviets could move into and move on to those weakened Eastern European nations, then they could have conquest. And they could take them over without much of a fight, and knowing full well that the United States was exhausted from World War II and were unlikely, until NATO, to commit ourselves to defending these Eastern European nations and Central European nations. Stalin's cruelty was unparalleled. Stalin was responsible for murdering millions of people, literally millions of people. This news of his cruelty, this news of his conquest, this news of his commitment to communism was enough to give rise to American fears. Now, it was in 1950 that Joe McCarthy was going to give this lecture to Republican women in West Virginia. And this was kind of a small-time potatoes shop, because West Virginia was a Democratic state at the time. So McCarthy gets this opportunity. And so what he does is he announces that day that there are so many, a certain number, 200 communists in the Defense Department, and we should get rid of them because they've invaded our government. Well, this was enough for him slowly to get to the national media. Now I want to go back just for a minute to the Soviets to build up what our fear of them was. In 1948, not long after the war was over, the Soviets decided they were going to blockade Berlin. What they wanted to do is they wanted to starve out Berlin. And we'll study a little bit more about this in the next lesson. They blockaded Berlin, and the United States, under the Truman administration, which itself was weakened after World War II. Remember, Truman was an unelected president until he stand in 1948 and got elected in his own right. The Soviets blockaded Berlin. They tore up the highways, they tore up the railroad, they stopped barge traffic, and it was only by the Berlin airlift, by the Canadians, the French, the British, and the Americans, flying in all the supplies that the Berliners needed, that Berlin was able to survive. And that lasted almost a full year, 28th of June 1948 until the 12th of May 1949. Now remember, Berlin was in East Germany, so the Russians thought if they captured or subjugated Berlin, it'd be easy for them to take over all of Eastern Germany. So this is the backdrop. This is the circumstance in the world and in Europe where Joe McCarthy made this speech. Joe McCarthy was a member of Karl Mundt's committee, Mundt, a North Dakota Republican. The Republicans had gained in 1946 the majority in the House and the Senate. McCarthy started holding these hearings. McCarthy started announcing there were by numbers so many. If you've ever seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate, there is a wonderful character there, Senator Johnny Iceland, who is clearly patterned after Joe McCarthy. And he has difficulty remembering how many communists there are. And so his wife gives him a little hint. He remembers 57 communists, just like Heinz 57 varieties of tomatoes. This was a sad and devious man. Now there were, at the time, for the first time, televised hearings of Senate committees. And you could see Joe McCarthy on full display. You could see these charges he made, and you could see the people sometimes weak in their defense. Annie Lee Moss was working as a communications clerk in the Signal Corps in the Pentagon. She had unreadable encrypted messages. She had no access to the Pentagon code room, and she had been identified by name by an FBI informant who had infiltrated the Communist Party. Miss Moss was a widowed mother who was temporarily discharged for a while, was reinstated after the Army made an investigation. She was not a communist threat, but Joe McCarthy treated her as if she were one. He had people who were helping him. One was a young attorney, an ambitious young attorney by the name of Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was willing to say anything, attack anyone, and do what might to serve Joe McCarthy's aims. And it was just who Roy Cohn was. So these hearings came at a time of terrible instability in American politics and in world politics. Now, I will show you here a cartoon by Herbert Bloch. Herbert Bloch, just weeks after McCarthy's speech in West Virginia, gave this phenomenon a name. He called it McCarthyism. And you can see from the cartoon that it is just one tar bucket after another, stacked on top of each other. And McCarthy apparently was setting the stage for the Republicans and for them to define themselves as anti-communists in the McCarthy mode. Herb Bloch's cartoon shows that rather dramatically and rather dangerously. Whenever you get a demagogue or a scoundrel like McCarthy leading the parade, you're never quite sure where it's going to go. Now, one of the great journalists of the 20th century was Edward R. Murrow. We have seen and we will see more of his work. Murrow had this program called See It Now. He and his staff looked into these McCarthy allegations. He, on his program, just disclosed the lack of evidence that McCarthy had, just disclosed the cruelty of McCarthy's methods. And there was a very famous exchange in the See It Now broadcast where Edward R. Murrow calls Joe McCarthy to task. And it was Murrow, the honest journalist, the scrupulous journalist, who took McCarthy to task and finally showed some spine that other Republicans followed in the Senate and others in public life generally disavowed Joe McCarthy, leading to his censure. It was an awful time in America, a time that was fragile. Fragile in Europe, fragile in world affairs, fragile in American economic terms. And there was just a little bit of truth to what McCarthy was saying. Now, were there communists working in the Defense Department, State Department? Sure, there probably were. There were probably libertarians. There were probably socialists. There were probably Democrats. There were probably Republicans. But these were not people who were taking their marching orders from the Stalin-esque regime in Moscow. It was a sad time in America. And it's a lesson that we must revisit, or else we may fall to the same kind of unscrupulous messaging that Joe McCarthy gave us. Let us hope that day does not repeat itself. And now you know at least a little bit of the lesson of Senator Joe McCarthy.